Okay. All right. I propose we are slowly starting, and it is recorded anyway. So today's webinar is on the topic of democratic backsliding and support for public good provision in the European Union. Our distinguished speaker today is Dr. Max Herrmann. Dr. Max Herrmann is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Humanities, Social and Political Sciences at the famous ETH Zurich. He's working in the group of multilevel politics. He's part of the research grant Public Insurance in Multilevel Politics. And this project examines preferences for transboundary risk sharing in and beyond the European Union. Previously, he served as a postdoc at University of Constance Cluster of Excellence, the politics of inequality. He earned his PhD in political science from University of Constance. His dissertation focused on preferences and coalition formation in European Union internet policy. His research interests center on European integration, European Union policy making, digital policy, international solidarity, and public opinion towards cooperation and risk management across levels of government. So, Dr. Herrmann, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation and the kind introduction. The topic today is democratic backsliding and support for public good provision in the European Union. And this is a joint work that I have done with my colleagues, Sharon Boute and Dirk Leuven from the University of Constance, my previous research home before moving on to ETH. So I'll largely talk about this paper, which has been published in the Journal of European Public Policy in May of this year. I try to keep the introduction a bit broader. So first, I think we should situate the topic in a bit of a broader perspective on democratic backsliding in multi-level systems. So democratic backsliding, as you probably know, refers to the gradual erosion of democratic norms in institutions, and it is moved forward by elected governments and elites. So this is arguably the biggest challenge to democracy in the 21st century, rather than a side of military coups or similar violent upheavals. This more gradual process has captured our attention and the attention of researchers. Now, how should we think about democratic backsliding in the context of multi-level systems? So traditionally, federalism has been argued to be a favorable system to protect democracy. So this has already been advanced in the Federalist Papers from the US Revolution, where federalism has been described as a double security, whereby we not only rely on the federation, like on the division of powers on the horizontal level between sort of the executive, the legislature, and the courts, but also we have a separation between the federal level and the state level. This supposedly provides this double security for democracy and against the backsliding in the tyranny, as the founding fathers of the US have written. However, comparative politics scholars have noticed that actually this doesn't really work out so well in the real world. Rather than states being a protector against backsliding on the federal level, we've seen across the world the persistence of so-called autocratic enclaves. So subnational units, subnational states with lower levels of democracy than at the federal level. And this has been observed in Latin America, in the post-Soviet world, also in the United States, for example, before the Civil Rights Act, but also more recently. And Grumbach, for example, has written this book where he calls the states in the the states in the United States the laboratories of democratic backsliding. Recently, this quantitative study by Kaufman et al. Also has shown that there's no systematic relationship between federalism and democracy or democratic backsliding. So also, as scholars who are more interested in European integration or maybe international organizations, we have kind of had a similar discussion, right? So after the end of the Cold War and the enlargement of the European Union, the enlargement of NATO and other international organizations, there has been the idea that such international or regional organizations have the potential to lock in democracy and prevent these newly democratic states from sliding back into autocracy. However, obviously, as you well know, that in the European Union this has not turned out so well as we or as scholars have thought in the early 2000s. Now, democratic backsliding in an EU member state or in just any kind of subnational system could be a problem for the others. And there's quite a nice quote from a year ago in the European Parliament when Ursula von der Leyen criticized Hungary and Viktor Orban as for some of their policies, and she used this sentence: "This is just throwing problems over your neighbor's fence." So this just is a nice illustration how that problems that exist at one part of this multi-level system could actually spill over. And for the European Union, this is problematic because it has from the beginning had this idea that the self-conception as of a community of liberal democracies. So democracy and the rule of law are fundamental community norms which are enshrined into European treaties. They are associative obligations, so they are preconditions for joining. There are sanctions, most prominently in Article 7, that punish violations of the rule of law and the violation of democratic norms. And the EU has over time developed a great variety of monitoring and sanction instruments, which often, of course, have not turned out as so useful or effective, but they are there in principle. So there's a consensus among scholars of the European Union that democratic backsliding harms civil and political rights of European citizens, and they also distort democratic representation at the European level, since both the national governments are, of course, represented in the Council, and these states also have their representatives in the European Parliament. So we have here, for example, two pairs of authors which have quite different normative perspectives of what the EU is and should be. So the more federalist perspective from Daniel Kellerman and a more intergovernmental or democratic perspective from Sandra Gröge and Richard Bellamy. And while these are different ideas on what is actually what kind of system the EU should be, both agree that democratic backsliding is a problem for the European Union. There's actually also a nice quote in the rule of law conditionality regulation, which was the most prominent instance where the European Union tried to link their budget and especially payments to member states towards rule of law conditionality. So and here this regulation actually spells out a problem that has been illustrated a little bit by the von der Leyen quote before. Respect for the rule of law is essential not only for union citizens, but also for business initiatives, innovation, investment, economic, social, and territorial cohesion, and the proper functioning of the internal market, which will flourish most where a solid legal institutional framework is in place. So this is actually something that is enshrined in European law also on this level as a justification, while this is a bit more economic focused because here it's about monetary conditionality. Now, what do we know about democratic backsliding in the European Union? Obviously, this has been a big research field in the recent years. We know there's been a lot of work on the domestic process of democratic backsliding in affected countries. There's also been quite a focus on explaining why the EU has not been able to stop them. There's the argument by Daniel Kellerman, which focuses on party political incentives. For example, why the European People's Party has been tolerating Fidesz for quite a long time for power political reasons. But there are also arguments related to sort of norms of diplomacy and national sovereignty and non-interference, which has made the EU reluctant. There has also been a fear that both among scholars but also among policymakers that if the EU would intervene too much into these states, that might create public backlash and maybe create rally around the flag effect in affected countries. I will come back to this point later when I show you my data. So public opinion has not been a big field within the study of democratic backsliding in the EU. Of course, when it comes to democratic norm violations and democratic transgressions and their tolerance, there's a big literature on that in terms of what citizens think on the national level. In the EU context, the research so far has focused mainly on attitudes towards EU enforcement among the citizens of member states which are targeted for rule violations. So all these studies that you can see here, they are mainly done in countries such as Hungary and Poland, focusing really on them as being recipients of EU sanctions. There are some studies also, for example, the one by Schliphack et al. From 2023, which have other countries, but there they focus on also Western European countries, but there they focus on more hypothetical cases, not real world cases. So for me, this raises the question, what can we say about the opinion of citizens in other member states? So how would we think about, as European citizens, think about democratic backsliding in other EU member states, not in our own? And before moving now into the specific theory and data, I want to give a brief introduction of how we got to this topic. So there are two papers that I want to briefly touch on. The first one is a study that we did in 8 European member states, where our focus was on differentiation, on differentiated integration. And there we had, among a series of items, we had one item which asked whether you would support excluding member states which violate core norms of the EU, whether you would support excluding them from EU common policies and the benefits from these policies. And there we found quite a strong support. This is a graph for the pooled sample, but you can also see this then if you break it down to the individual member states. A strong indication that people want our member states to follow the rules of the game, so to say. However, there's also a bit of an issue if that we've been quite imprecise in the formulation of the item in the survey. So there we just spoke about violation of norms, and this was not explicitly tied to democratic norms. So, for example, if I would show you now the individual country graphs, you would see, for example, that there's a big, some opposition in Italy, where we thought this had maybe less to do with democracy, but maybe Italians were still thinking more about the Maastricht criteria and the Maastricht rules and the debt rules. So this is only a first sort of indication that there's maybe something going on here. Now, in a second paper, which I co-authored with Sebastian Groß and Dirk Leuven, and which here we focused on European solidarity during the COVID pandemic. And here we did a survey experiment among German citizens, where we looked into the conditions so how certain characteristics of potential recipient countries would affect Germans' willingness to support them with medical or financial aid in crisis. And here, this is the result of one of 3 experiments that we did as part of this paper. And here we can see that, of course, things like need in a crisis need, but also preparedness for a crisis and the capacity to deal with external help are important. But there are also 2, and you can see those in the sort of bottom part of the graph, two concepts which relate more to community norms. So this is reciprocity, reciprocal help across different types of crisis, and the community norm of the rule of law. So what we show here in this experiment was that Germans think that countries are more deserving of aid if they follow the rule of law and if they have been taking in refugees during the migration crisis. So if they have already contributed to this overall community of solidarity community of the EU. So here we have some stronger indication that people make solidarity conditional on following to certain community standards or norms. Now, the paper for which I've been asked to present today is the paper published in CHEP with my colleagues Sharon Boute and Dirk Leuven. And here our questions were really explicitly: do European citizens support sanctions against norm violating member states, with a clear focus on democratic norm violations? And how does democratic backsliding in member states and also the EU's response to this democratic backsliding affects citizens' support for EU policies and also for the EU as a regime? So theoretically, we draw here on insights from behavioral economics on how humans deal with norm violations, and then we test this with original survey data from 4 countries. And in general, I want to say that this is a paper that, while it deals with democratic backsliding, it speaks very much to this sort of emerging literature on how political events in one country affect political attitudes in other EU member states. Now, why should citizens care at all about what's going on in other EU member states? We want to not start with like a normative theory on why they should care, but we're very interested in what could be a reason, a behavioral reason of why they act like that. And here we went back to the literature on human behavior that is from behavioral economics, from lab experiments, which have been showing now very consistently for a long time that humans cooperate and are very happy to cooperate. They are not purely selfish. However, they will stop cooperating if they feel that others violate cooperative or other social norms. So this has been tested with a variety of games, such as the public good game or the trust game. Especially this literature shows that humans punish free riders which do not cooperate, even if this is costly for themselves. So they are willing to forego certain benefits just to punish others. And if we now move from the lab back to the field, and if we move from the micro level of interhuman action to the macro level of interstate relations, we think that EU citizens should support the sanctioning of norm-violating member states, even if this requires certain trade-offs in terms of policies. A second part of this literature shows that while reciprocal punishment can sustain cooperation for a long time, cooperation erodes if there's a lack of effective punishment opportunities. So if a game that you play in the lab is not, we are not able to sanction someone, then you will also just stop cooperating and behave selfishly. And from this, we formulate then the expectation that democratic backsliding, and especially the lacking of effective norm enforcement, reduces support for EU policies as well as for the EU as a system. Now here we see already a little bit of a difference, of course, because as individual citizens, you are not able to punish another member state for their norm violations, but you have to rely on the European institutions to do that. And so we focus here also on the perceptions of how whether there's effective norm enforcement from the EU side. Now we have I briefly walk you through the hypothesis that we are testing, and then we show you the results. So first, we focus on support for sanctions. And here we, most generally, as I just said, citizens support sanctioning of norm-violating member states by excluding them from the benefits of European cooperation. And if we think about which citizens are more likely to do this, we think about, classical ideological explanations such as left-right or Galtan, sociocultural liberal preferences. Support for the EU, of course, is should be an important reason. And also drawing back on this literature that I just talked about, a disposition for strong reciprocity should increase support for sanctions. So the laboratory literature also shows that not every human is willing to sanction to the same amount. So there are people who have a stronger sort of personal disposition and value reciprocity more strongly. This should also occur here. Now, this, of course, could be moderated by your perception of self-interest, whether it's you individually or more sociotropic interest for your state and community. So we think that citizens who think that their own country might become the target of EU sanctions, they should be less supportive of such sanctions. However, of course, human citizens in a country are not all of the same opinion, and as we know, there is strong opposition also towards backsliding governments. So here we expect that there's probably a government opposition divide within the population of a country in this regard. And then finally, coming to the question of what is the effect for EU support, both in terms of policy and regime. As I said, we think that democratic backsliding should reduce EU support. However, this could be moderated again by what the EU is doing in response. So effective EU norm enforcement could counteract the decline in public support, while if EU norm enforcement turns out ineffective, this would, it might not make the situation worse in the eyes of citizens, but at least it should not ameliorate the situation. Now, we're going to test these hypotheses with original survey data that have been collected as part of our project at the University of Constance, the Conditions of International Solidarity project, where we in total do 3 surveys, and this is the first one. This was in the field in October and November 2023. We have more than 6,000 respondents from 4 countries, Germany, Italy, Poland, and Sweden, to sort of cover the 4 macro regions of the European Union. And this is data from online access panels, so not fully representative, but we use quotas for age, gender, education, and region within countries to sort of approximate representativeness. And we have an observational part and an experimental part. Both have been pre-registered, and the observational part will be the first one that I present. This is specifically about support for sanctions and for testing hypothesis 1 and 2, while the experimental part is more about providing information to citizens about democratic backsliding and the effectiveness of the EU's response and how then this affects policy and regime support. So we have 3 variables to measure sort of support for sanctions. The first one is just a very general statement. You should take measures to protect democracy. The second one and the third one are more demanding in that they relate to specific policies, which of course have different purposes. So item B here is about whether you would support violation of so sort of you would support that member states which violate democratic norms should be excluded from cohesion funds, which of course are an instrument to create greater equality within European regions, between European regions. And then the third one is potential green subsidies. So this is more of a hypothetical policy that was discussed in 2023 when we ran the survey. So here the question would be if the EU would introduce subsidies to support the energy transition, should then norm violators be excluded from these subsidies? And this again creates a trade-off, because for an effective energy transition, for effective climate policy, we would hope that all countries participate, since it's a global problem. So, and what you can see here is in these descriptive statistics that support for exclusion, support for measures to protect democracy is quite strong, but it becomes a bit weaker if you ask for a specific policy solution. So if you introduce these competing ideas that are behind these policies, then people become somewhat less supportive. But this is mainly expressed through a greater proportion of people who select sort of a middle category, where they are sort of in between and not really sure whether they should support such a measure or oppose it. Now, if we go to the individual level and see what kind of individual factors affect support for these 3 types of sanctions, or 3 statements, we can see quite in line with what we have argued, that EU supporters are more supportive of sanctions. left-wing people and more socio-culturally liberal people are more supportive. And also the strong reciprocity disposition that I mentioned before seems to drive people's support for sanctions. Quite interesting. If you ask about sort of more rule following, some more authoritarian values, actually, such as there should be harsher sentences for crimes. And then you can also see that this increases support for sanctioning. Now, what about your hypothesis two, your own effectiveness? You see here quite a small effect only. But it reduces support for sanctions a little bit. And I will zoom now into the case of Poland, which of course is among the 4 countries that we surveyed, the one which is most clearly affected by this discussion. And here you can see voting patterns from the 2023 parliamentary election. So this was around the time when we fielded the survey. Poland voted for the same, and those is what people said who they voted for. And there you can see a clear government opposition divide, while the then outgoing Law and Justice supporters of the outgoing Law and Justice government were quite opposed, while supporters of Donald Tusk's civic platform, but also of the Freeway and the New Left, were more supportive. So here we can see that rather than seeing a unique sort of national pattern of Polish people being afraid of sanctions against their country, we see rather that there's a clear partisan divide. Now let's move on to the experiment. So we conducted information experiment. We provided respondents with 2 types of information about democratic backsliding in general, and then about the EU's response, and we varied whether this is effective or ineffective. And then we measured this with with outcome variables, both on the level of regime support, so satisfaction with EU democracy, satisfaction with how the EU works. That's the variable. Whether EU unification should go further, trust in the European institutions. And on the policy level, again, we have 2 different types of policies, which both have sort of a cross-border benefit. So a potential green investment fund and cooperation in the area of police and judicial authorities. Now we have 4 groups, 3 treatment groups and 1 control group, which does not receive anything. So the 3 treatment groups all receive information on democratic backsliding. According to its founding treaties, the European Union is a community of democracies. However, some member states, including Hungary, have been criticized for violating key democratic norms, such as the independence of courts. Such violations of democratic norms may negatively affect the rights of European citizens and make it more difficult for EU member states to agree to joint actions. And then we vary. So the first group only gets this information. The second group gets also information on what the EU is doing, and it's a positive signal. Yeah, the EU is starting to withhold funds from Hungary, and this, according to some experts, is a sufficient measure to enforce compliance. The treatment group 3 receives the opposite statement, saying, okay, we are withholding these funds, but this is far from enough. Now, what do we find? I can make this short. We don't find anything. So here we really, our information experiment did not work. We could not manipulate opinions. You see maybe in the satisfaction with the functioning of the EU, you could see a little bit of a more positive development in the second treatment group, where we say, yeah, there's effective norm enforcement, but this is not significant. And basically, we don't find anything. This doesn't vary across member state. This is the pool sample. This doesn't vary across the member states much. There's very little also in terms of individual variation between sort of more left-wing or more right-wing respondents, or about respondents with higher political knowledge than those with less political knowledge, for example. So there's really nothing there. So I can conclude. Our survey experiment shows no effect of our information treatments on policy and regime support. in the first glance, this is actually great news for the EU. So public support seems to be resilient against this democratic backsliding. However, of course, there might be two problems with that. First, we only mention one example, Hungary, which is the most famous one, so to say. So people might be well aware of this. So they have been pre-treated. People might have known this and made up their mind about what they think about the situation. Actually, other studies by, for example, Toshkov et al. And Stiansen et al. Find similar results as well for the Polish public where they conducted surveys. People already know most of these things. We think that one explanation could be that democratic backsliding might not have reached a critical threshold in terms of the affected member states if we would have not given like one case but multiple cases. If there would be a bigger portion of member states violating norms, then people might respond differently and might reconsider their support for EU. However, our observational analysis shows that there is robust support for sanctions, even if that requires sort of policy trade-offs. And this can be explained by political attitudes, and is in the countries which are affected, probably moderated by partisan effects rather than creating strong rally around the flag effect, as has been, previous studies have or previous authors have worried about. So, in short, even though we don't find this negative effect on EU regime support and policy support, we nevertheless believe that the adherence to community norms is a condition for European solidarity, as we see that people are clearly willing to exclude countries from certain EU benefits, and this could in a crisis situation actually be problematic if EU solidarity would be undermined because citizens have the impression that not all members play by the same rules and not keep to the rules of the game that the EU has given itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hermann, for this very interesting talk. Now the floor is open for questions and answers. So I think you can either raise your hand or you can write into chat and ask questions to our speaker or make some comments. So the floor is open. So maybe we can take the presentation away, then we can see all the members of the audience. If you close your PowerPoint, thank you. All right. I have a question about Poland, because Poland was also backsliding and recently stopped backsliding. The question is, did you see any effect in the Polish society about this change of direction of the Polish government, or it was too early?
Now, so when we collected the data, this was just before the election or around the time of the election. So we could ask, what are you, what you're going to vote for, which party or which party you just voted for. But this was before the government, before the current coalition was formed and took office. So we don't know about that.
Okay. So your study was a bit too early for the to measure the effect of the Polish change of government. That's fine. Are there any other comments from the audience? Questions to the offer? I think it's interesting that you didn't find a big difference between these three different groups. So maybe you're right that the basic position around Europe is stronger than actual responses. And maybe also the question of sanctions of Hungary were not published so widely. So, for example, when I was checking if I can invite the University of Hungary, it wasn't very clear if this is against the sanction or with the sanction. So I think the European Union tries to play down a bit this Hungarian problem.
Yeah, so this is actually this is a fear that has been around in both the academic literature and in policy circles. The European Commission and our member states are worried, of course, about a backlash. And there have been also authors who think about this in terms of this rally around the flag effect, if there would be sort of an external enforcement, external sanctions that might actually unite citizens in the country, and might create support. And I think also this there has been work on sort of how parties in Poland talk about this, also from before the last elections, where it's not so clear whether these national actors also want to emphasize this EU part so strongly or not, because it's not clear. Many are worried about this backlash. Well, in our data we don't find this. In our data we see more of a clear partisan split. There's also been a study in Poland which shows that strong supporters of the EU within the country have become somewhat disenchanted and a bit disappointed. I think they use the term Euro disappointment, something like that, where they say that you can see in these sort of strong pro-EU circles a sort of disappointment that the EU has not done more or could not protect the country more during the law and during the peace government period.
Yes. So I think also in Hungary, I have the feeling that there is some sort of game behind closed doors. So Hungary makes a veto, and then the European Union is discussing with them to give them a little bit of the money which they blocked, let's say 500,000 or 2 million euros or more. And then suddenly the veto disappears. So there seems to be some behind closed door policy, not to make a big fuss about it, but say, okay, you veto now, we offer you to release some of the blocked funds, and then suddenly Hungary stops to upkeep the veto.
Yeah, this is definitely going on, and I think if you would, I still think about what could we have done differently. So what kind of information would actually affect people more, and we try to have this in our treatments, have both sort of the negative effect, sort of the basically we wrote three things, right? We said that the EU has this understanding of itself as a community of democracies. This is violated by some member states, and here we used the Hungary example, and we say this violates democratic rights for citizens, but it also makes it more difficult for EU member states to agree. And maybe this is a point that could be strengthened more, and it could be tested whether citizens respond more critically if it comes to this sort of uh, pork barrel politics that you just described,
Yeah.
the Kuhhandel, or if that is
Exactly.
maybe has a strong effect, but it's clear that this is a problem, and this has been identified as a problem, especially during the in with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where
Yeah.
where also EU member states have become more critical. The governments of other EU member states have become more critical. We see this from the Nordic countries, for example, which have used the argument that Hungary is blocking too much of the EU foreign policy actions with regard to Ukraine, and try to then bring back the Article 7 procedure for that reason.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a question by the TRUEDEM team in the chat. You found no significant decline in policy or regime support despite exposure to backsliding scenarios. Could this suggest a deeper resilience in EU support or apathy towards institutional performance?
I mean, both can be true. So in the first instance, you would think, yeah, okay, this does not change people's use level of EU support. This is in a way a good news. It shows resilience, but it might be conditional to the fact that we have only used one example that is also very
Yeah,
famous.
yeah,
So as I mentioned, I think if you would do a more hypothetical study and move away from the real world and you play around with the number of countries violating different kind of norms and you would move from one country to 9 or 10, then it would look different. So I think there's more to be explored in that sense. There was
Yeah.
we also got an interesting comment regarding this what you call the apathy towards institutional performance. So it could be that the EU or that citizens they want action even if it doesn't work. So maybe they like the symbolic performative aspect of threats or some punishment, even if that is in the end not deemed effective. So rather than not doing anything, you would just do something, even if it doesn't work and it doesn't influence then the outcome so much. This again, we can't really test with our
Yeah.
design because we did not have a group which says that the EU is not doing anything at all, which would also not be true. But this is something also that could be tested further if we would move towards a more hypothetical scenario.
Yeah. I think there's another comment from the TRUEDEM team. In Sweden, you observe the only significant treatment effect, the small but measurable drop in regime support when the respondents are primed with information about democratic backsliding without effective enforcement. How do you interpret this finding in contrast to the nil results in Germany, Italy, and Poland? Could this reflect a particularly high baseline expectation among Swedish citizens to democratic law enforcement or norm enforcement in the EU?
So here someone has been reading the paper carefully because I did not
Yeah,
show
yeah,
this in the presentation. Um, I don't I don't have a clear explanation for
yeah,
that. I think also if you look at the other variables in Sweden, this, they're also it's not so clear. I don't have a clear answer why this is the
yeah.
case in Sweden compared to the other countries.
We have
But it would be
for Sweden here, Professor Puranen. Maybe B can give us some information about if Sweden is different in this respect to Germany or Italy.
I think potentially so. Sweden is not the most integration friendly
Yeah,
country. So it's clearly a net contributor to the EU budget, but it's been more on the frugal side,
yeah,
not part of the euro. So there
yeah,
as a sort of net contributor country in the EU, it might be more citizens might be more reluctant to provide resources to countries which don't play by the norms. And I think
yeah,
like the Netherlands would be a similar example.
yeah,
And I think this is in the study that I mentioned at the very beginning about the democratic about differentiated integration, where I showed you this one aggregated graph. We don't have Sweden, we have Denmark, but I think for Denmark and the Netherlands in that survey, we found quite strong effects that people are very yeah critical of norm violations, and this might have something to do with their status as like that contributors to the EU budget.
yeah. Because they might think we pay much more than Hungary, but Hungary can play around with us. So it's more against sort of free riding, getting lots of money and violating the norms. And so maybe the European Commission thinks that in Hungary something similar like in Poland might happen, that the prime minister will be replaced by another prime minister who has a EU-friendly perspective like in Poland. So maybe they are playing with time and the elections are next year. So maybe this problem might be solved by the next elections. But it has to be considered anyway because that's the problem of this veto that one country can really put a lot of sand into the whole engine, and they will not solve it now, but it's a big issue. And you're right. Countries which are paying more than they get back, they are more critical to have money thrown at people who are misbehaving.
Yeah, so I mean Again, the first time we can be a bit optimistic in for the Hungarian case, maybe. But this is, I think, also something that is clear that the real change will have to come from national political actors, and the EU can,
Yes.
uh, through its sanctions, maybe increase pressure on the government. It can also create visibility for the problems, so it works as sort of a fire alarm. Uh, so this is yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
but we also saw that I think that the European Commission was quite quick in the case of Poland to drop to unfreeze some of the money that they withheld after the
Yeah.
Tusk government took over. And it's not necessarily, and given the many veto players also with the Polish president, it's not clear uh, whether the government can implement enough reforms to actually stabilize the situation. And maybe it's not so good for the credibility of these sanctions if just a government change will change the situation a lot.
Yes, I think one conclusion of your interesting paper and presentation is that the European Commission cannot stop backsliding in different countries themselves. So they cannot be this sort of European police going there, fixing it, and then also sort of task force. It has to be done at the end of the day by the national parliament and the national government. So it's not a centralized state like France. We are a federal group of 24 countries. And so